In the spring of 2019, a construction crew breaking ground for a new parking lot in Bursa, Turkey made a discovery that would send shockwaves to the archaeological community. 3 meters beneath the courtyard of the Ulu Cami, one of the oldest mosques in the region, their excavator's bucket punched through into empty space. What they found below defied everything historians thought they knew about the Ottoman Empire's treatment of conquered peoples. The chamber was vast, stretching nearly 40 meters in length, its vaulted ceiling still intact after more than 5 centuries of darkness. But it wasn't the architecture that stopped the workers cold. It was the walls. Every surface was covered in murals, Christian murals, depicting scenes of martyrdom so vivid and brutal that several of the crew members refused to return to the site. And in the center of the chamber, suspended from iron chains that had long since rusted through, hung a massive bronze bell, its surface covered in inscriptions in 3 languages: Greek, Arabic, and Ottoman Turkish. Within days, the Turkish Ministry of Culture had sealed the site. Within weeks, representatives from the Vatican, the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople, and several international archaeological organizations were demanding access. And within a month, a team of specialists was carefully documenting what they found, including one detail that nobody could explain. The bell, which had hung silent in that underground chamber for 500 years, had begun to ring again. Not loudly, not constantly, but in the dead of night, security cameras captured its slow, impossible movement and the low, mournful tone that echoed through the empty chamber. This is the story of what that bell witnessed. This is the story of an empire's greatest secret, a crime so terrible that it was buried beneath the very symbol of conquest, hidden away where Christian and Muslim alike hoped it would never be found. This is a story of how power corrupts absolutely, how silence becomes complicity, and how the dead sometimes refuse to stay buried. The year was 1453, and Constantinople, the jewel of the Byzantine Empire, the city that had stood for over 1,000 years as the bulwark of Christendom against the Islamic world, was falling. Sultan Mehmed II, later called Mehmed the Conqueror, had laid siege to the city with an army of over 80,000 men and a fleet of hundreds of ships. The Byzantine Emperor Constantine XI commanded perhaps 8,000 defenders, supplemented by a few thousand Italian mercenaries and volunteers. The mathematics were brutal and simple. For 57 days, the bombardment continued. Mehmed had brought with him the largest cannon ever constructed, a monster called Basilica that could hurl a 600-pound stone ball over a mile. The ancient Theodosian walls, which had protected Constantinople for a millennium, crumbled under the assault. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine knew the end was coming. He spent his final night in prayer at the Hagia Sophia, the greatest church in Christendom, knowing he would never see another dawn. On May 29th, 1453, Ottoman forces breached the walls. Constantine died fighting in the streets, his body so mutilated that it was never positively identified. For 3 days, as was the custom of the time, Mehmed allowed his soldiers to sack the city. What happened during those 3 days has been documented by historians from both sides. The slaughter was immense. The rape and enslavement of civilians was systematic. The looting of churches and monasteries stripped Constantinople of treasures accumulated over centuries. But this story isn't about those 3 days. Every conquest in history has been accompanied by atrocity. What makes the fall of Constantinople different, what the murals in that underground chamber depict, is what happened after the 3 days ended. On the 4th day, Sultan Mehmed entered the city in triumph. He rode directly to the Hagia Sophia, the architectural marvel that had stood for nearly 1,000 years as the heart of Orthodox Christianity. According to Ottoman records, he was appalled to find his soldiers still looting the church. He struck one man who was prying up marble tiles from the floor and declared the sacking over. Then he ordered the immediate conversion of the Hagia Sophia into a mosque, a process that began that very day. This act is well documented. It's in every history book. What isn't in the history books is what Mehmed found when he descended into the catacombs beneath the church. What isn't recorded is what he ordered done about it. And what has been completely erased from both Ottoman and European records is what happened in the weeks and months that followed. The murals in the underground chamber tell the story that the written records do not. They were painted by someone who witnessed everything, someone who had access to pigments and materials even after conquest, someone who worked in secret for months or perhaps years to create a visual record of events that both empires agreed should never be spoken of again. The first mural shows the interior of the Hagia Sophia on that fourth day. Sultan Mehmed is clearly recognizable, as are several of his generals and advisors. But the focus of the painting is not the Sultan. It's what the soldiers are carrying up from the depths of the church. Bodies. Dozens of them. But these are not the bodies of soldiers killed in the siege. These are the bodies of children. The Byzantine Empire, in its final desperate years, had been riven by theological disputes that made the Protestant Reformation look tame by comparison. One faction, the Hesychast, believed in an extreme form of monasticism and mortification of the flesh. Another faction, which never had an official name because its very existence was denied by the Patriarch, believed that only through sacrifice, literal human sacrifice, could God be convinced to save the city from the Islamic threat. In the final year before the fall, as the Ottoman noose tightened, as the Italian city-states refused to send adequate help, as the Pope's promise of a new crusade proved empty, this faction grew in influence. They found adherents among the most desperate, the most faithful, and the most fanatical, and they convinced hundreds of families that God demanded the blood of the innocent. The historical record shows a spike in missing children in Constantinople in the year before the fall. Chronicles mention it obliquely, usually blaming the chaos of war or disease. But the bodies Mehmed's soldiers found in the catacombs beneath the Hagia Sophia told a different story. These children had been sacrificed, ritually murdered by their own parents and priests in increasingly elaborate ceremonies designed to win God's favor and save the city. It didn't work. The city fell anyway, and Mehmed was faced with a terrible dilemma. He was not the monster that Christian propaganda later painted him as. The historical record is actually quite clear on this. After the initial 3 days of sacking, Mehmed was relatively merciful by the standards of the time. He protected the remaining Christian population, appointed a new patriarch, and allowed churches outside the city walls to continue operating. He wanted Constantinople, renamed Istanbul, to become a jewel of his empire, a cosmopolitan center of trade and culture. He needed the city's surviving Christian, Jewish, and Muslim populations to coexist peacefully. The discovery in the catacombs threatened all of that. If word got out that Byzantine Christians had been sacrificing their own children, it would ignite sectarian violence that could tear his new capital apart. His own soldiers, many of them recently converted Christians from the Balkans, might turn on the Christian population in horror and disgust. The Islamic scholars who were his advisors would demand harsh measures against what they would see as the most depraved form of paganism. But if Mehmed revealed what he had found, he also risked something else. The Christian kingdoms of Europe, which had watched Constantinople fall with barely a protest, would have perfect propaganda to launch a new crusade. They could paint all Eastern Christians as depraved child murderers who deserved their fate, justifying further Ottoman expansion as a civilizing mission. Or they could claim that the Byzantines had been driven to desperation by Islamic aggression, making them martyrs to rally behind. So Mehmed made a decision. He brought in the new patriarch, a man named Gennadios Galerios, who had only been appointed 2 days earlier. The meeting between the Muslim Sultan and the Christian patriarch is recorded, but the actual content of their conversation is not. We know only the result. An agreement, a pact of silence. The bodies would be quietly removed and buried in secret. The catacombs would be sealed. No Ottoman record would mention the discovery. No Christian authority would speak of what had happened in the final desperate months before the fall. The handful of priests who had participated in the sacrifices would be quietly executed, their deaths attributed to the chaos of the conquest. The families who had given up their children would live with their guilt and their silence. And everyone would pretend that the slaughter of the innocents had never happened. The second mural in the chamber shows this meeting. Mehmed and Gennadios stand facing each other, and between them is a table on which rests a single object, a bell. The same bell that now hangs in the chamber center, the bell that had begun to ring again after 500 years. According to the inscription on the bell itself, which researchers have now fully translated, it was cast in 1452, the year before the fall. It was commissioned by one of the priests involved in the sacrifices, a man named Theodoros Lascaris. who left a confession inscribed in the bronze. He wrote that the bell was created to be rung each time a child was sacrificed, that its sound would carry their souls to heaven and alert God to the sacrifice being made on his behalf. He wrote that 43 times the bell had rung, 43 children, 43 souls. After the Pact of Silence, the bell could not be destroyed. To melt it down would risk someone reading the inscription. To leave in the Hagia Sophia, now a mosque, was impossible. So it was taken to Bursa, the former Ottoman capital, and buried in a chamber built specifically to house it and to house the murals that told the true story of Constantinople's fall. The chamber was built beneath the site, where a mosque would soon be constructed, ensuring it would never be accidentally discovered. It was sealed with the blessing of both the Sultan and the Patriarch, and there remained a secret shared between empires, between faiths, between men who agreed that some truths were too terrible to speak. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the dead have a way of demanding justice. The researcher who first entered the chamber and documented the murals was a Turkish archaeologist named Dr. Eileen Demir. In her initial report, she noted something that deeply troubled her. The murals were not all painted at the same time. The first ones, depicting the discovery and the pact, were clearly created shortly after 1453. The artist was skilled, the materials were fresh, the style was consistent with mid-15th century Byzantine iconography. But there were other murals, dozens of them, painted later. Some appeared to be from the 16th century, others from the 17th. A few seemed as recent as the 18th century. Someone had been entering the sealed chamber for over 300 years, adding to the pictorial record, documenting something that was still happening. The later murals tell a darker story still. They show that the Pact of Silence was not the end of the sacrifices. It was merely the end of them being conducted openly. The families who had given up their children, the priests who had performed the rituals, they did not stop believing that God demanded blood. They simply learned to be more careful, more secret, more selective. Throughout the Ottoman period, in both Istanbul and in communities across the empire where Orthodox Christians lived, children continued to disappear, not in large numbers, never enough to attract official attention, but steadily, consistently, 1 or 2 per year, taken in the dead of night, their bodies never found. The murals show them being brought to this chamber, which certain priests apparently still had access to. They show the bell being rung, just as it had been rung before the fall. They show the continuation of a practice that both empires had agreed to bury. And they show something else. They show that some Ottoman officials knew, not the Sultan, perhaps not the highest levels of government, but local authorities, the kind of men who could be bribed or threatened or convinced to look the other way. The kind of men who perhaps feared that if they intervened, the whole terrible story would come out, and the fragile peace between Muslims and Christians in the empire would shatter. The complicity was not total. Many of the murals show failed rescues, show Muslim neighbors trying to protect Christian children, show priests who refuse to participate being killed by the fanatics. The story is not one of an entire faith gone mad, but of a small, terrible cult that survived in the shadows, protected by fear and by the power of the secret they held over both Christian and Muslim authorities. The sacrifices continued, according to murals and the dates that could be determined from them, until sometime in the 1760s. The final mural shows something different from all the others. It shows a group of people, both Christian and Muslim, standing together in the chamber. It shows them sealing the entrance, not just with stones, but with what appears to be powerful oaths and prayers. And it shows the bell no longer suspended, but lying on the ground, its chain broken. After 1760, there are no more murals. The chamber fell silent. The entrance was so thoroughly sealed that it was forgotten. The mosque above was rebuilt and expanded several times over the next 2.5 centuries, but no one discovered what lay beneath. The secret was finally buried, the bell was finally silenced, and the dead were finally allowed to rest. Until 2019, until a construction crew's excavator broke through into the darkness, until archaeologists entered with their lights and cameras and began to document what they found, until the world learned that beneath one of Islam's holy sites lay evidence of Christianity's darkest chapter, and until the bell began to ring again. The phenomenon has been studied extensively. Seismologists confirmed there were no tremors that could have caused the bell to move. Structural engineers verified that the building above was stable and not settling in any way that could create vibrations. The chamber itself is climate controlled now, and there are no air currents strong enough to move a bell of that size and weight. Yet security footage from dozens of nights shows the same thing. Around 3 a.m, the bell begins to sway slightly, just enough for the clapper to brush against the bronze, just enough to produce that low, mournful tone that echoes through the chamber. Some researchers have suggested electromagnetic anomalies. Others point to the bell's unusual composition, which includes metals not typically found in bronze alloys, and which might respond to the Earth's magnetic field in unexpected ways. Skeptics note that the bell is over 500 years old and might simply be responding to stresses and vibrations too subtle for instruments to measure. But those who have spent time in the chamber at night offer a different explanation. They say that if you listen carefully, if you stay past midnight and sit in the darkness with only the mural for company, you can hear more than just the bell. You can hear whispers, children's voices, 43 of them from before the fall, and countless more from the centuries after. They say the voices are not asking for vengeance. They're not angry or accusatory. They're simply bearing witness, simply refusing to let their deaths be forgotten again. Dr. Demir, in her final report before she resigned from the project, wrote something that caused considerable controversy. She wrote that the chamber should not be preserved as a museum or a historical site. She wrote that the bell should not be studied or displayed. She wrote that the chamber should be resealed, blessed by both Christian and Muslim clergy, and left undisturbed in perpetuity. She wrote that some secrets are kept buried not to protect the guilty, but to protect everyone else from knowledge too terrible to bear. Her recommendation was not followed. The chamber is now a museum, accessible by appointment only, with strict limits on photography and public access. The bell has been moved to a climate-controlled display in Istanbul, where it sits silent behind thick glass, its inscription visible to scholars, but not to casual visitors. The murals have been photographed and documented, though the Turkish government has not released all the images to the public and has restricted access to several of the later paintings that depict identifiable locations and families. The reaction to the discovery has been predictably complex. The Orthodox Church initially denied that the events depicted in the murals ever happened, calling them Ottoman propaganda designed to defame Christianity. When carbon dating and pigment analysis confirmed that the murals were authentic and had been painted over a period of centuries by multiple artists, the church changed its position. Now, the official stance is that a small heretical sect, not sanctioned by church authority, committed these crimes, and that the patriarch who agreed to the Pact of Silence did so under duress from the Ottoman conquerors. Islamic scholars have been more willing to acknowledge the truth of what happened, perhaps because the role of Ottoman authorities in the story is less damning. Mehmed and his successors are portrayed as having tried to stop the sacrifices through the Pact of Silence, and the later complicity of local officials is presented as a failure of individuals rather than policy. Some scholars have even argued that the discovery validates the Ottoman claim to have been more tolerant and civilized than Christian polemics have suggested. But there are other voices, quieter ones, that tell a different story. Historians who have studied the records more carefully point out that the Pact of Silence, while perhaps motivated by a desire to prevent sectarian violence, also served the interests of power. Both empires, Christian and Muslim, had more to lose from the truth than they had to gain. Both chose order over justice. Both chose their own stability over the lives of children who were being murdered in secret. And there are descendants. Through careful research of Ottoman tax records and Byzantine family registries, genealogists have identified several families in modern Turkey and Greece who are direct descendants of the people depicted in the murals. Some are descended from the victims, others from the perpetrators, a few from the priests who agreed to remain silent. These people have had to grapple with the knowledge that their ancestors were either murdered in the name of God, or murdered others in the name of God, or knew about the murders and said nothing. One woman, whose ancestor is shown in a mural from 1486 participating in a sacrifice, has become an advocate for victims of religious violence worldwide. She speaks publicly about the need to acknowledge historical crimes, even when they complicate our understanding of our own traditions. She says that her faith in Christianity is not diminished by knowing what was done in its name, but strengthened by the commitment to ensure it never happens again. Another man, whose ancestor was one of the children sacrificed before the fall of Constantinople, has demanded that the Orthodox Church formally apologize and excommunicate posthumously all the priests involved. The Church has refused, maintaining that it cannot excommunicate people for actions taken by a heretical sect that was never officially part of the Church. He has responded by leaving orthodoxy entirely and founding his own small congregation dedicated to remembering the victims. The bell itself has become an object of pilgrimage for some and a source of horror for others. Despite the glass case and the restricted access, thousands of people have requested to see it. Some are historians and researchers. Others are simply curious. But many are people of faith, both Christian and Muslim, who want to confront this physical evidence of what their traditions are capable of when taken to extremes. And then there are those who have heard the stories about the bell ringing in its new home. The museum officially denies this, but security guards tell a different story. They say that sometimes, late at night, when the museum is closed and the halls are empty, they hear it. That low, mournful tone. That impossible sound from behind thick glass in a room with no vibrations. No air currents, no explanation. They say it sounds like mourning, like a warning, like a reminder that the dead do not forget, even when the living try their hardest to make them. The question that haunts everyone who studies this story is not whether the events depicted in the murals actually happened. The evidence is too strong, too consistent, too detailed to dismiss. The question is what we do with this knowledge now that we have it. Do we condemn an entire faith tradition for the actions of fanatics? Do we use this story as ammunition in modern political and religious conflicts? Do we dismiss it as ancient history, irrelevant to contemporary concerns? Or do we sit with the discomfort it creates and ask ourselves what it reveals about the nature of power, faith, and complicity? Because the truth is, this story is not unique to 15th century Byzantium. Throughout history, in every culture, in every faith tradition, there have been those who believe that God demanded blood, who believe that the ends justified the means, who believe that their holy cause was more important than the lives of the innocent. And throughout history, in every culture, in every faith tradition, there have been those who knew what was happening and said nothing, who prioritized stability over justice, who chose silence over scandal, who decided that some secrets were better kept buried. The Ottoman and Byzantine authorities who agreed to the Pact of Silence in 1453 were not uniquely evil. They were men faced with an impossible choice in a brutal time, and they made the decision they thought would cause the least harm. Perhaps they were right. Perhaps revealing the truth would have caused religious wars that would have killed thousands more. Perhaps their silence saved lives. But their silence also allowed the killings to continue. For over 300 years, children died because the truth was too dangerous to speak. And when we read this story, when we stand in that underground chamber and look at those murals, we have to ask ourselves what we would have done. We have to ask ourselves what we're doing now, in our own time, about the secrets that powerful institutions keep. The Catholic Church's sexual abuse scandal, the complicity of governments in human trafficking, the knowing participation of corporations in environmental destruction, the secrets that politicians keep about corruption and violence. We live in a world where the powerful still prioritize their own stability over justice for the innocent, where we still choose silence over scandal, where we still bury the truth beneath the very symbols of our civilization and hope no one digs deep enough to find it. The bell rings not just for the children of Constantinople. It rings for all the victims of powerful institutions that chose secrecy over accountability. It rings as a reminder that buried truths have a way of surfacing, that the dead refuse to stay silent, that justice delayed is justice denied, but that even after centuries, even after the guilty are dust and the systems that protected them have fallen, the truth still matters. In the 2 years since the chamber was discovered, there have been calls for a formal inquiry into whether similar practices occurred in other parts of the Byzantine Empire in its final years. Researchers have begun examining records from other Orthodox communities in the Balkans, in Russia, in the Middle East, looking for patterns of missing children, for unexplained rituals, for evidence that what happened in Constantinople was not an isolated incident. So far, the evidence is inconclusive. There are suggestive patterns, but nothing as clear as the murals in that underground chamber. Nothing as damning as the bell with its inscription of crimes. But the search continues, driven by the conviction that if this happened once, if it was kept secret for so long, then we owe it to the victims to find out the full truth. And there are ongoing debates about what should be done with the chamber itself. Preservationists argue that it must be maintained as a historical site, that future generations need to be able to see this evidence with their own eyes. Religious leaders argue that it should be consecrated as a memorial, a place of remembrance and prayer for the victims. Archaeologists want continued access for research. Victims' descendants want a say in how their ancestors are remembered. The Turkish government, caught between competing pressures, has taken the position that the chamber represents a shared heritage of sorrow that belongs to all humanity. They have resisted calls to restrict access based on religion or nationality, but they have also refused to allow the site to become a circus of controversy and sensation. The balance is delicate, and the debates continue. Meanwhile, the bell sits in its case in Istanbul, silent during the day, silent when tourists pass by and read the placard that explains, in carefully neutral language, what was used for, silent when scholars examine it and debate the meaning of the inscriptions and the significance of its unusual composition. But at night, according to those who work in the museum, it sometimes rings. Not every night, not even most nights, but often enough that the security guards have stopped reporting it, stopped trying to find rational explanations, stopped pretending that they are not deeply unnerved by the sound of bronze on bronze echoing through empty halls. They say that when it rings, they feel compelled to stop what they are doing and listen. They say the sound seems to demand attention, to refuse to be ignored or dismissed. They say that after hearing it, they find themselves thinking about the story, about the children, about the choices that were made, and the secrets that were kept. They say it feels like being haunted, but haunted by something that does not want to terrify them, only to be remembered. One guard, in an interview he later tried to retract, said something that has stayed with everyone who has followed this story. He said that the bell is not ringing because of electromagnetic anomalies or structural stresses or any physical explanation. He said the bell is ringing because the story is not finished. He said that as long as powerful institutions continue to bury their crimes, as long as we continue to choose silence over truth, the bell will keep ringing. He said it will ring until we learn the lesson that the dead have been trying to teach us for 500 years. That lesson is simple but difficult. It is that there is no secret so terrible that it justifies perpetual silence, that the truth, no matter how painful, is better than the comfortable lie, that justice for the innocent matters more than the stability of the powerful, that we owe the victims of historical crimes not just our sorrow, but our commitment to ensure that such crimes never happen again. The empire's sin was not just the sacrifice of children by desperate fanatics in the final days of Byzantium. It was a decision by both empires, Christian and Muslim, to bury the truth rather than confront it. It was a choice to prioritize order over justice, stability over accountability, their own interests over the lives of the innocent. It was a belief that some secrets should stay buried forever. They were wrong. The construction crew in Bursa proved them wrong. The murals that refused to fade prove them wrong. The bell that rings after 500 years of silence proves them wrong. The dead prove them wrong. Over and over, by refusing to be forgotten, we cannot undo what was done. We cannot bring back the 43 children who died before the fall, or the countless others who died in the centuries after. We cannot punish the guilty or reward those who try to stop them. They are all dust now, all beyond the reach of earthly justice. But we can remember. We can refuse to turn away from the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it makes us. We can acknowledge that our faith traditions, our institutions, our civilizations are capable of terrible things when unchecked by accountability and transparency. We can commit to being the people who shine light into the dark corners where secrets are kept, who refuse to accept that some truths are too dangerous to speak. And we can listen when the bell rings, when the dead call out to us from across the centuries, when the victims of historical crimes demand that we see them, acknowledge them, remember them, when they refuse to let their suffering be buried beneath the monuments of empire and the pieties of faith. The chamber beneath the mosque in Bursa is small, dark, and cold. The murals are fading despite preservation efforts. The bell is safely housed behind glass in a museum where it can harm no one. The story of the empire sin is now known to scholars and historians, and to anyone willing to seek it out. But the ringing continues. In the dead of night, in the hours when the living sleep, and the dead keep their vigil. In the moment between forgetting and remembering, the bell rings, and it will continue to ring until we finally understand what it is trying to tell us. That the past is not past. That the buried will not stay buried. That the truth, no matter how long suppressed, has a way of making itself heard. And that we, the living, have a responsibility to listen and to learn and to ensure that we do not repeat the sins of those who came before us. The empire tried to bury its sin beneath a mosque in Turkey. They kept it secret for 500 years. But secrets have a way of surfacing, and the dead have a way of demanding justice, even from the grave.